What does it take to stand alone against the most powerful military machine ever assembled? For nearly 2 years, from the fall of France in June 1940 until the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Britain faced the Third Reich without any major ally capable of challenging German dominance on the European continent. This period, often romanticized in popular memory as Britain's finest hour, was in reality a desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming odds. The world watched, many expecting Britain's imminent collapse. Neutral observers calculated that the island nation could not possibly withstand the German juggernaut that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in 6 weeks. Yet Britain did not fall. What happened next shocked the world. Not Britain's survival, remarkable as that was, but what German generals said about it after the war. In memoirs, interviews, and war tribunals, the very commanders who had orchestrated the Blitzkrieg campaigns across Europe made stunning admissions about Britain's resistance. They revealed strategic miscalculations, spoke of opportunities lost, and acknowledged that Britain's standalone fight had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. These were not the statements of defeated men seeking to excuse their failures. They were professional military assessments that challenged popular narratives about the war and forced reconsideration of what Britain's lonely stand had actually accomplished. The conventional narrative presents Britain's survival as primarily the result of geography, the English Channel as an impassable moat, combined with Churchill's inspirational leadership and the courage of RAF pilots during the Battle of Britain. While these factors were undeniably important, German generals after the war pointed to different, more profound reasons why Britain could not be defeated. Their post-war assessments revealed that Britain's resistance involved dimensions of strategic thinking, economic resilience, and psychological warfare that went far beyond simple military courage. The island that stood alone was not merely surviving, it was actively preventing Germany from achieving the strategic position necessary for ultimate victory. To understand the magnitude of Britain's isolated position, one must comprehend the geopolitical situation in June 1940. Within 9 months of war's outbreak, Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and, most shockingly, France. The French army, considered among the world's finest, had collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving behind virtually all its heavy equipment. Italy had entered the war on Germany's side. The Soviet Union was bound to Germany through the Nazi-Soviet pact. The United States remained determinedly neutral, constrained by powerful isolationist sentiment. Britain stood alone, but what did alone actually mean? The British Empire still existed. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India provided troops, resources, and moral support. However, these dominions and colonies were geographically distant, their militaries small compared to continental armies, and their resources took time to mobilize and transport. In immediate military terms, troops that could counter a German invasion, aircraft that could defend British skies, ships that could protect British waters, Britain relied primarily on its own resources during the critical months of 1940-1941. The strategic situation appeared hopeless by any conventional analysis. Germany controlled the entire European coastline from Norway to Spain. German submarines operated from French Atlantic ports, dramatically shortening their operational range against British shipping. The Luftwaffe deployed from airfields across conquered territories, bringing every part of Britain within range of German bombers. German armies, flush with victory and equipped with captured French, Czech, and Polish weapons, stood poised across the Channel. Britain's army, evacuated from Dunkirk with barely its rifles, could not hope to defeat German forces in open battle. Economic analysts predicted Britain's collapse within months. The island nation depended on imports for food, fuel, and raw materials. German submarine warfare threatened these lifelines. The United States, while sympathetic, maintained neutrality and cash-and-carry policies that limited Britain's ability to purchase war materials. British gold and dollar reserves were finite. Economic warfare seemed likely to accomplish what military invasion might not, starving Britain into submission without firing a shot. Yet within this context of apparent hopelessness, Britain made decisions that would prove historically consequential. Churchill's government rejected any negotiated peace despite considerable pressure from within the cabinet. Britain continued fighting in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and at sea, stretching limited resources across multiple theaters. Most importantly, Britain maintained offensive operations, bombing Germany, supporting resistance movements, gathering intelligence, and preparing for eventual return to the continent. This was not merely defensive survival, but active resistance that tied down German resources and prevented consolidation of Hitler's European empire. The German perspective in June 1940 combined confidence with uncertainty. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel later recalled, "We had crushed every enemy we faced. Poland in 3 weeks, Norway in 2 months, France in 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht seemed invincible. Britain appeared next on the list, and we expected similar results. But there was uncertainty about how to bring British power to battle. They had withdrawn from the continent. The Channel separated us, and Britain showed no inclination to seek peace despite their hopeless situation." This uncertainty within German high command would prove more significant than British observers understood at the time. The German military machine, so effective in continental warfare, faced challenges it had not anticipated when confronting an island power with naval superiority and determination to continue fighting regardless of circumstances. The very geography that had allowed Britain to avoid continental entanglements for centuries now provided defensive advantages that German operational planning had not fully considered. The technological context also deserves attention. In 1940, amphibious operations were extraordinarily difficult, even for military forces with experience in such operations, which Germany lacked. The Royal Navy, though stretched thin, remained the world's most powerful navy. Britain possessed radar, giving defensive advantage to fighter aircraft. British code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park were beginning to penetrate German communications, though this remained highly secret. These technological factors, combined with geographic advantages, created defensive capabilities that were not immediately apparent to external observers, predicting Britain's imminent collapse. The psychological dimension of Britain's isolated position also mattered profoundly. The British people, having witnessed the fall of France and faced the prospect of invasion, developed a collective determination that foreign observers, including German generals, consistently underestimated. This was not blind optimism, but rather a grim determination to resist regardless of cost. Churchill captured this mood in his famous speeches, but he was articulating rather than creating the national psychology. The determination to never surrender was not mere rhetoric. It was operational policy that would shape every British decision during the period of fighting alone. The imperial dimension requires more detailed examination. When Britain fought alone, this was true only in the narrow sense of facing Germany without continental European allies. The British Empire mobilized vast resources. Canadian factories produced weapons and aircraft. Australian and New Zealand forces fought in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Indian soldiers served in multiple theaters. African colonies provided strategic materials and bases. This imperial mobilization meant Britain was never truly alone in material terms, though the coordination, transport, and deployment of these resources took time that Britain did not have in the desperate summer of 1940. The diplomatic isolation Britain faced was equally significant. Most neutral countries expected German victory and adjusted their policies accordingly. Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, Turkey, and others maintained neutrality that favored Germany through trade relationships and diplomatic recognition. Even the United States, sympathetic to Britain, maintained official neutrality that limited the support America could provide. Britain could not count on allies, could not assume neutral nations would provide assistance, and faced the real possibility that American public opinion might shift toward accepting German domination of Europe as inevitable. The global context of Britain's isolated position extended beyond Europe. Japan threatened British interests in Asia. Italian forces menaced British positions in the Mediterranean and North Africa. Vichy France, though technically neutral, controlled substantial naval forces and colonial territories that could potentially be used against Britain. The Soviet Union, bound to Germany by the Nazi-Soviet pact, represented an unknown factor that could conceivably join Germany in attacking British interests. Britain faced threats from multiple directions, with resources barely adequate to defend against Germany alone. The financial dimension of Britain's isolation created particularly acute pressure. Pre-war Britain had been world's financial center, but war expenses depleted reserves rapidly. American neutrality laws required cash payment for weapons and supplies, Britain's ability to continue purchasing vital materials depended on liquidating overseas assets and taking on debt. The United States drove hard bargains, acquiring British assets at favorable terms. Britain was not just fighting for survival, but mortgaging its financial future, selling off accumulated wealth of empire to sustain the war effort. This created an unstable situation where financial exhaustion might force capitulation even if military position held. The period of Britain fighting alone officially began on June 22, 1940, when France signed its armistice with Germany. Britain had entered the war in September 1939 with allies, France, Poland, and eventually others. The collapse of France and evacuation of British forces from Dunkirk transformed the strategic situation fundamentally. Britain now faced Germany without any continental ally capable of engaging German ground forces. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Within 9 months, Britain's military position had shifted from confident alliance to isolated desperation. The immediate threat was Operation Sea Lion, Germany's planned invasion of Britain. German preparations for this operation began in July 1940. The plan required air superiority to protect invasion barges crossing the Channel, suppression of Royal Navy forces, and establishment of defensible beachheads on the British coast. However, German military planners recognized enormous challenges. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy, later wrote, "I never believed Sea Lion was feasible. The Kriegsmarine lacked the resources to guarantee safe passage across the Channel. The Royal Navy would have intervened with catastrophic effect on our invasion fleet. Only complete air superiority could have made the operation remotely possible, and I doubted whether even the Luftwaffe could achieve that." The Battle of Britain, fought from July to October 1940, became the crucial test of whether Germany could neutralize British air defenses sufficiently to attempt invasion. The Luftwaffe launched sustained attacks against RAF airfields, radar installations, and eventually British cities. The battle's outcome would determine whether Sea Lion proceeded. German pilots and commanders initially expected victory within weeks. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe would crush British air resistance and open the way for invasion. What followed shocked German military planners. The RAF, though outnumbered, fought with effectiveness that German intelligence had not anticipated. British radar provided early warning that multiplied the defensive value of fighter aircraft. RAF pilots, flying over their own territory, could return to combat quickly when their aircraft were damaged. Most importantly, British aircraft production actually exceeded German production during this critical period, a fact that German intelligence failed to recognize. The Luftwaffe suffered unsustainable losses. General Adolf Galland, who commanded German fighter forces during the Battle of Britain, later provided frank assessment. "We underestimated everything about British air defense, their radar, their fighter aircraft, their production capacity, and especially their pilots' determination. We thought we were fighting a beaten enemy waiting for the coup de grace. Instead, we faced an opponent who became more dangerous as the battle continued." By September, it was clear we had failed to achieve the air superiority necessary for invasion. This was the first time German arms had been stopped, and the psychological impact on our forces was significant. The failure of the Battle of Britain forced fundamental reassessment within German high command. Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely in September 1940, though Germany maintained the deception that invasion remained possible. In reality, German strategic planning shifted toward other objectives: support for Italy in the Mediterranean, preparation for attack on the Soviet Union, and economic warfare against Britain through submarine campaign and bombing of cities. Britain would not be invaded, but Germany hoped to pressure Britain into negotiated peace through continued military pressure and economic strangulation. Britain's response to this strategic situation demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Rather than simply defending, Britain maintained offensive operations across multiple theaters. In North Africa, small British forces defeated much larger Italian armies, capturing enormous numbers of prisoners and demonstrating that Axis forces were not invincible. In the Atlantic, British escorts fought to protect convoy routes against German submarine wolf packs. British bombers struck German cities and industrial targets, doing limited physical damage, but forcing Germany to maintain extensive air defense networks. British intelligence services supported resistance movements across occupied Europe. The economic dimension of Britain's isolated fight deserves particular attention. Britain faced potential bankruptcy as gold and dollar reserves depleted. The Lend-Lease program, enacted by the United States in March 1941, provided crucial economic lifeline. However, before Lend-Lease, Britain had to purchase weapons and materials with cash or credit. British negotiators accomplished remarkable diplomatic achievements, securing American support despite formal neutrality, gaining access to American industrial production, and maintaining economic viability through creative financing and American goodwill. Lord Halifax, British Foreign Secretary, later reflected on this economic desperation. "We were spending money we didn't have, making promises we couldn't keep, and relying on American sympathy that could evaporate if public opinion shifted. Yet we had no choice. Without American supplies, we could not continue the war." The period before Lend-Lease was economically more precarious than most realize. We were mortgaging Britain's future on the belief that America would eventually enter the war and make good on what we owed. The intelligence war during this period also proved crucial, though its significance remained secret for decades. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park achieved breakthrough with German Enigma codes, providing intelligence that shaped operations across all theaters. German generals, writing memoirs decades later, expressed shock when they learned how comprehensively British intelligence had penetrated German communications. General Günther Blumentritt wrote, "Had we known the extent of British intelligence capabilities, many of our operations would have been planned differently. They were reading our messages in near real time, giving them advantage that no amount of military skill could overcome." The period from fall 1940 through spring 1941 saw Britain's position gradually stabilize. Invasion threat receded. RAF Fighter Command recovered from Battle of Britain losses. British industry mobilized for war production. Military forces, though small compared to continental armies, became increasingly professional and effective. Most importantly, Britain demonstrated that it could not be defeated by any means Germany currently had available. This negative achievement, proving German inability to force British surrender, was strategically more significant than any positive victories Britain achieved during this period. The transformation of Britain's isolated position from desperate survival to sustainable resistance occurred gradually, without single decisive turning point. Multiple factors contributed: American economic support, successful defense of shipping lanes, victories in North Africa, growing effectiveness of bomber offensive, and expansion of intelligence capabilities. By spring 1941, though Britain remained alone in facing Germany, the strategic situation had shifted from existential crisis to grinding attrition that Britain could sustain indefinitely. German generals, planning the invasion of the Soviet Union scheduled for June 1941, recognized that Britain's continued resistance created strategic complications. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, noted in his diary, "Britain's refusal to make peace means we fight on two fronts. The Führer believes that conquering Russia will force Britain to terms, but this seems optimistic. Britain has demonstrated remarkable resilience. Leaving them in our rear while we engage the Soviet Union creates risks that prudent military planning would avoid." The civilian experience of Britain's isolated period deserves more attention than military histories typically provide. British civilians faced bombing, rationing, blackouts, and constant anxiety about invasion, yet civilian morale remained surprisingly resilient. The Home Guard mobilized over 1 million men, most with minimal equipment but maximum determination. Civil defense organizations coordinated response to bombing raids. Factory workers maintained production, despite attacks on industrial areas. This civilian mobilization, while militarily secondary to RAF and Royal Navy operations, created psychological foundation for continued resistance that German intelligence consistently underestimated. Mass Observation, a social research organization documenting British civilian life, recorded attitudes during this period that revealed complex psychology. People were afraid but determined, pessimistic about immediate prospects but confident about eventual victory, angry about military setbacks but supportive of continued resistance. This was not mindless optimism, but rather pragmatic determination to endure regardless of cost. German propaganda, which assumed that British morale would collapse under pressure, fundamentally misunderstood this mentality. The role of exile governments and military forces in London also shaped Britain's strategic position. Polish, Czech, Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian, and Free French forces operated from Britain, providing manpower and legitimacy to continued resistance. These forces were militarily modest in size but symbolically important. They represented continued opposition to German occupation throughout Europe. Britain was not just fighting for itself, but serving as base and symbol for all occupied peoples who refused to accept Nazi domination. The development of special operations during Britain's isolated period also merits examination. The Special Operations Executive, established in July 1940, coordinated sabotage, espionage, and support for resistance movements across occupied Europe. Though SOE's early operations achieved limited results, the organization established framework for irregular warfare that would prove increasingly important. German generals after the war acknowledged that SOE operations, combined with resistance movements SOE supported, created security problems that diverted German resources from frontline combat. The air war evolved significantly during Britain's isolated period. After abandoning invasion plans, Germany shifted to night bombing of British cities, the Blitz. From September 1940 through May 1941, German bombers struck London and other cities repeatedly. The campaign killed over 40,000 civilians and destroyed vast amounts of property. Yet it failed to break British morale or force political capitulation. Instead, it unified British society and provided moral justification for British bombing of German cities. The Blitz became an example of strategic bombing's limitations. It could cause tremendous suffering, but could not force capitulation of determined population with effective government and civil defense. The naval war in the Atlantic represented perhaps Britain's most critical struggle during the isolated period. German submarines operating from French bases attacked convoys bringing food, fuel, and military supplies from North America. British and Canadian escorts fought desperate battles to protect merchant shipping. The statistical balance was grim. Submarines sank ships faster than they could be replaced. Merchant seamen died in cold Atlantic waters, and Britain's import capacity declined month by month. Only the combination of improved escort tactics, intelligence from Enigma decrypts, and eventually American involvement prevented catastrophic losses that would have strangled Britain's war effort. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, who commanded Western approaches from 1941, later described the desperation of this period. "We were losing the Atlantic battle in late 1940 and early 1941. Losses exceeded our capacity to replace ships and cargoes. Had this continued much longer, we would have faced genuine starvation regardless of German invasion or bombing." The U-boat campaign was Germany's most effective weapon against Britain, and it came closer to forcing our capitulation than anything else they attempted. That we survived this period owes much to intelligence advantages we could not publicly acknowledge, and to the courage of merchant seamen who kept sailing despite appalling casualties. The most profound theme emerging from German post-war assessments of Britain's isolated resistance was the fundamental miscalculation about British strategic culture. German military planning, influenced by continental European traditions, assumed that military defeat would produce political capitulation. Poland had fallen when its army was destroyed. France had surrendered when Paris was threatened. This pattern led German strategists to expect similar British behavior when isolated. Yet Britain operated according to different strategic logic. Geography, history, and political culture created a national capacity for sustained resistance that German analysis failed to anticipate. General Blumentritt, in extensive post-war interviews, addressed this miscalculation directly. "We understood British military capabilities reasonably well, their forces, equipment, industrial capacity. What we failed to understand was their political culture. Britain had not been successfully invaded in nearly 900 years. They had lost battles, even wars, yet always survived. This historical experience created a national psychology we could not comprehend. When facing continental enemies, Britain had always maintained sea power and waited for allies. They saw their situation in 1940 not as unprecedented disaster, but as difficult period to endure until circumstances changed." This theme of strategic patience versus German operational impatience pervades post-war German military analysis. The German way of war emphasized decisive battle, rapid victory, and clear resolution. Britain practiced strategic patience, accepting temporary setbacks, maintaining capability to continue fighting, and waiting for circumstances to shift in their favor. German forces could win battles, but could not force the strategic resolution that German planning required. This created psychological frustration within German high command that affected subsequent strategic decisions. The economic dimension of Britain's resistance provides another central theme in German post-war reflection. German generals consistently underestimated British economic resilience. The expectation was that blockade would starve Britain into submission within months. Yet British economic management, combined with American support, sustained not just survival but active military operations across multiple theaters. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring later observed, "We thought we understood economics. We had prepared Germany's economy for war. But Britain managed its economy with skill we had not expected. They prioritized ruthlessly, maximized production, and secured American support through effective diplomacy." By 1941, British war production exceeded what we thought possible given their resource constraints. The technological theme also emerges powerfully from German post-war statements. British technological advantages, particularly radar and intelligence, provided defensive capabilities that German analysis had not anticipated. General Josef Schmid, who headed Luftwaffe intelligence, later admitted, "Our intelligence regarding British capabilities was catastrophically inadequate. We underestimated their radar network, their fighter production, and their ability to decode our communications. These intelligence failures gave Britain advantages that multiplied the effectiveness of their smaller forces. Had we understood their true capabilities, the Battle of Britain might have been conducted very differently." The moral and psychological dimensions of Britain's resistance shocked German observers who had expected collapse of civilian morale under bombing. The Blitz, Germany's bombing campaign against British cities from September 1940 through May 1941, was intended to break civilian will to resist. Instead, it strengthened British determination. General Heinz Guderian reflected, "We thought terror bombing would break British morale as it had broken Poland's resistance. We were completely wrong. The bombing unified British society, created determination to resist, and gave them moral clarity about the nature of our regime. It was strategic error born of misunderstanding the psychology of island peoples who have never been conquered." The theme of sea power's continued relevance in modern warfare also pervades German post-war analysis. The Kriegsmarine, though formidable in submarine warfare, could not contest British surface naval superiority. This meant that Germany could never effectively blockade Britain or protect an invasion force crossing the Channel. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded German submarine forces, later wrote, "Britain's survival ultimately rested on sea power. We sank tremendous tonnage, but we could never sink enough to starve Britain or prevent American supplies from arriving. The Royal Navy, even reduced from its imperial height, remained powerful enough to maintain Britain's maritime lifelines. Without surface naval superiority, we could wound Britain, but never kill it." The role of leadership in sustaining resistance emerges as another theme, though German generals disagreed about its significance. Churchill's leadership was universally acknowledged, but German assessments debated whether any British leader could have secured negotiated peace in 1940. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt argued, Churchill was the right leader for Britain's situation, but any British leader would have faced enormous pressure to continue fighting. British political culture, parliamentary system, and public opinion would not have accepted surrender. Churchill articulated what the British people already believed. Hitler's error was thinking that changing British leadership could change British policy. The strategic theme of keeping options open versus committing to single strategy distinguishes British from German approaches. Britain maintained operations in multiple theaters: North Africa, Mediterranean, Atlantic, bombing campaign against Germany, despite resource limitations. This diffusion of effort seemed militarily inefficient, yet it provided strategic flexibility and ensured that even if one campaign failed, others continued. General Halder noted, British strategy seemed scattered and unfocused compared to our concentration of force, yet this gave them resilience. When we defeated them in one theater, they were already operating in others. There was no single decisive point where we could force them to capitulation. The intelligence dimension receives extensive attention in German post-war memoirs. The revelation that Britain had broken German codes shocked military officers who had trusted Enigma's security. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, admitted, "Learning that our communications had been compromised was devastating. So many operations that failed, so many convoys we lost, so many of our submarines that were sunk. We attributed these to British skill or luck. Now we know they were reading our orders. This intelligence advantage was worth dozens of divisions. Had we known, we would have changed our communication methods immediately. The theme of strategic overextension also appears in German reflections. Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union, while Britain remained undefeated, created two-front war that German strategic tradition had always sought to avoid. General Warlimont later reflected, Bismarck's great lesson was to avoid fighting simultaneously in East and West. We violated this principle. Britain's continued resistance meant we fought on two fronts. The Führer believed that conquering Russia would force Britain to terms, but this was wishful thinking. Britain's survival guaranteed that we would fight a two-front war, and historically, Germany has never won such wars. The theme of alliance formation and diplomacy also emerges from German post-war analysis. Britain's diplomatic efforts to secure American support while maintaining relationships with neutral countries and coordinating with exiled governments represented strategic accomplishment that German planning had not adequately considered. Britain was not merely surviving militarily, but actively building the alliance that would eventually defeat Germany. German General Walter Warlimont acknowledged, while we focused on military operations, Britain was constructing the diplomatic framework for eventual Allied victory. Their relationship with America, their support for resistance movements, their coordination with exile forces, these were strategic preparations that we failed to disrupt or counter effectively. The theme of moral authority in war also pervades the narrative. Britain positioned itself as defender of civilization against barbarism, democracy against tyranny, law against aggression. This moral positioning, though sometimes hypocritical given British imperial practices, nevertheless provided psychological and diplomatic advantages. German generals after the war acknowledged that Germany's brutal occupation policies and racial ideology created enemies and strengthened resistance in ways that undermined military success. Britain's relative restraint and principled rhetoric, whatever its inconsistencies, provided strategic advantage that pure military analysis overlooked. The theme of adaptation and learning also deserves attention. Britain's military forces in 1940 were inadequately prepared for modern warfare. Defeats in Norway and France revealed deficiencies in equipment, tactics, and command. Yet British forces learned from these failures. By 1941, British military effectiveness had improved markedly. Training emphasized lessons from combat. Equipment improved through production priorities and American supply. Command structures adapted to modern warfare requirements. This organizational learning, while imperfect, contrasted with German tendency toward operational rigidity that became more pronounced as the war continued. German Colonel Hans von Luck later reflected on this British adaptability. We thought of British forces as rigid, bound by tradition and outdated thinking, yet they adapted faster than we anticipated. They learned from defeats, changed tactics, improved equipment, and became increasingly formidable opponents. By 1941, British forces we encountered in North Africa showed marked improvement over those we had faced in France. This capacity for institutional learning was a strategic asset we had not adequately appreciated. The theme of national unity, despite class divisions, also emerges from examination of Britain's isolated period. British society remained deeply stratified by class, yet the war created temporary sense of shared purpose that transcended these divisions. The slogan, "We're all in it together," though not entirely accurate, captured psychological reality that sustained resistance. German analysis had expected class tensions to undermine British unity, but this did not occur. Instead, shared suffering and common enemy created cohesion that surprised external observers and contributed significantly to Britain's ability to sustain the fight. The strategic solutions Britain developed during its period of fighting alone created a framework for eventual victory that German generals acknowledged in retrospect. The first solution was acceptance that victory in the traditional sense, defeating Germany militarily, was impossible for Britain alone. Instead, British strategy aimed at survival, attrition, and creating conditions where allies would eventually join the fight. This required psychological adjustment from a nation accustomed to military success, but Churchill articulated the strategy clearly: maintain sea power, build air strength, endure bombing, sustain economy, and wait for circumstances to change. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who commanded RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, implemented tactical solutions that maximized limited resources. The sector station system allowed efficient allocation of fighters to threatened areas. Radar provided early warning that multiplied defensive effectiveness. Pilot rotation preserved experienced commanders while giving new pilots combat experience. These innovations, combined with higher-than-expected aircraft production, created air defense system that denied Germany the air superiority necessary for invasion. German General Adolf Galland, after the war, provided detailed analysis of how British air defense succeeded. Dowding's system was masterpiece of defensive warfare. He conserved his forces, avoided the decisive battle we sought, and maintained sufficient strength to contest German air superiority. His sector stations provided command and control that multiplied the effectiveness of limited forces. Most importantly, he ignored political pressure to defend London at all costs and maintained focus on preserving fighter command as fighting force. Had he attempted to defend everything, we would have destroyed his forces piecemeal. Economic solutions developed by Britain during this period demonstrated creativity born of desperation. The Treasury, led by John Maynard Keynes, developed innovative financing methods that sustained war expenditure despite limited reserves. American economic support, negotiated through diplomacy and appeal to shared interests, provided resources that Britain could not generate domestically. Most importantly, Britain maintained harsh priority systems that ensured military production received resources even at cost of civilian consumption. Rationing, though unpopular, prevented economic collapse and sustained military capability. The intelligence solution centered at Bletchley Park proved among Britain's most valuable contributions. Breaking German Enigma codes provided strategic intelligence that shaped operations across all theaters. This intelligence allowed Britain to protect convoys, anticipate German operations, and achieve success disproportionate to its military resources. The decision to maintain absolute secrecy about these intelligence capabilities, even at cost of allowing some German operations to succeed, protected the source and ensured long-term intelligence advantage. Admiral Dönitz, after learning post-war about Enigma decryption, acknowledged its impact. Had I known that Britain was reading our submarine communications, I would have changed our entire operational method. The losses we suffered in the Atlantic, submarines sunk, convoys we failed to find, we attributed to British anti-submarine technology and convoy escort effectiveness. Now we understand they were reading our messages and routing convoys around our wolf packs, or concentrating escorts against our submarines. This intelligence advantage was worth hundreds of escort vessels Britain didn't have. Britain's solution to the invasion threat combined military preparation with strategic deception. Coastal defenses were strengthened, though British commanders knew they were inadequate against determined German assault. More importantly, Britain maintained visible preparations and public determination that convinced Germany that invasion would be extremely costly. The Home Guard, though poorly equipped, demonstrated national mobilization. Speeches and propaganda emphasized determination to resist. This psychological warfare, combined with RAF's demonstrated effectiveness, created perception that invasion would require German forces and resources that Hitler was unwilling to commit. The North African campaign provided crucial solution to Britain's strategic dilemma. Unable to engage German forces in Europe, Britain fought Italian forces in North Africa with remarkable success. Small British forces defeated much larger Italian armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners and demonstrating Axis vulnerability. These victories, though militarily modest, provided British public with much-needed good news and demonstrated that Axis forces could be defeated. General O'Connor's campaign in 1940-1941, which destroyed Italian forces in Libya, showed what British forces could accomplish when properly led and supported. Field Marshal Rommel, sent to North Africa after Italian defeats, later acknowledged British effectiveness. The British forces I encountered in North Africa were professional, well-led and determined. They had learned from their mistakes and fought intelligently. The myth that British forces were inferior to German forces was just that, myth. When properly equipped and commanded, British soldiers were formidable opponents. Their victory over Italian forces showed that Axis powers could be beaten, and this had important psychological effect on their nation and ours. The diplomatic solution Britain pursued focused on securing American support while maintaining relations with neutral countries. British diplomacy aimed at convincing America that British survival served American interests, that Britain could continue fighting if provided resources, and that eventual German defeat was possible. This required delicate balance, appearing strong enough to be worth supporting while acknowledging need for American help. Churchill's personal diplomacy with Roosevelt proved crucial, establishing relationship that would guide Anglo-American cooperation throughout the war. British propaganda and information policy during this period aimed at multiple audiences. For British public, emphasis was on determination, unity, and inevitable, eventual victory. For neutral countries, Britain highlighted German aggression and British resistance as defense of civilization. For occupied Europe, Britain provided hope that resistance was not futile and liberation was possible. For Germany, British propaganda emphasized the cost of continued war and the inevitability of German defeat. This multi-layered information campaign, combined with BBC broadcasts to occupied territories, created psychological impact that transcended Britain's limited military capabilities. The solution to maintaining civilian morale under bombing deserves particular attention. The Blitz killed over 40,000 British civilians and destroyed enormous amounts of property. Yet civilian morale did not collapse. This resulted from multiple factors: effective civil defense organization, accurate information about raid damage that prevented panic from rumors, visible leadership with Churchill touring bombed areas, and perhaps most importantly, the sense that suffering was shared across all classes. The King and Queen remained in London. Churchill refused protected bunkers. Everyone was in it together, and this psychological unity sustained national determination. The organizational solutions Britain developed for coordinating a global war effort from a small island also merit examination. The War Cabinet system, with Churchill as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, provided centralized decision-making. The Chiefs of Staff Committee coordinated military strategy across services. Various ministries managed economic mobilization, civil defense, information policy, and diplomatic relations. This governmental machinery, though imperfect and subject to bureaucratic conflicts, nevertheless coordinated national effort with reasonable efficiency. German generals after the war noted that Britain's democratic system, which they had assumed would be weakness, actually provided organizational flexibility and public support that totalitarian systems struggled to achieve. The scientific and technological mobilization Britain achieved during this period also provided crucial advantages. Radar development continued, with improved systems providing better early warning and fighter direction. Advances in code breaking expanded the intelligence advantage. Development of improved aircraft, weapons, and military equipment proceeded despite resource constraints. Most importantly, Britain maintained scientific community and research infrastructure that generated innovations throughout the war. German General Heinz Guderian later observed, Britain's scientific establishment provided continuous flow of innovations that improved their military effectiveness. We had scientific capability, but Britain organized theirs more effectively and applied research results more quickly to operational problems. The medical and logistical solutions Britain developed also deserve recognition. Military medical services, though strained by casualties, maintained effectiveness that kept wounded personnel returning to duty. Logistical networks, despite disruption from bombing and submarine warfare, continued functioning with remarkable resilience. Port workers, truck drivers, railway employees, and countless others, whose work never made headlines, nevertheless sustained the flow of supplies that made military operations possible. German General Wilhelm von Thoma later acknowledged, British logistics were better than ours in many respects. They maintained supply chains despite submarine warfare and bombing. Their medical services returned wounded soldiers to duty faster than ours. These unglamorous aspects of military capability significantly affected operational effectiveness. Britain's period of fighting alone, while ultimately successful in avoiding defeat, attracted significant criticism from multiple perspectives. Some critics argued that Britain should have negotiated peace in 1940, avoiding further suffering and preserving what remained of the British Empire. This view, suppressed during the war, but articulated by some historians afterward, suggested that continuing the fight was a quixotic gamble that happened to succeed, but could easily have failed with catastrophic consequences. Lord Halifax, who had advocated exploring peace negotiations in May 1940 before being overruled by Churchill and the War Cabinet, later reflected, "I believed we should at least explore whether acceptable terms could be negotiated. I did not advocate surrender, but thought prudent statesmanship required understanding what peace might cost." Churchill rejected this, arguing that Hitler's terms would be unacceptable and that negotiations would undermine British morale. He was proved right, but at the time his position was not obviously correct. Had circumstances been slightly different, his gamble could have destroyed Britain. Strategic critics questioned whether Britain's dispersed military efforts across multiple theatres represented optimal use of limited resources. Concentration of force is fundamental military principle, yet Britain fought simultaneously in North Africa, Mediterranean, Atlantic, and bombing campaign over Germany. Some military analysts argued that concentrating all available resources on single objective, perhaps North Africa or strategic bombing, would have produced better results than dividing resources across multiple fronts. General Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff from 1941, defended the distributed strategy. "We were criticized for fighting everywhere and nowhere, but we had no choice. We could not engage German forces in Europe, so we fought where we could. Each theater served strategic purpose. North Africa protected Egypt and Suez Canal. Atlantic campaign protected our lifelines. Bombing campaign struck at German industry and morale. We did what was possible with forces available, and this prevented Germany from consolidating its conquering position." The economic cost of Britain's resistance became clear only after the war. Britain had bankrupted itself fighting Germany, emerging victorious but economically devastated. The empire began dissolving almost immediately after the war. British global power declined precipitously. Some historians argue that negotiated peace in 1940 might have preserved British wealth and empire, even if it meant accepting German dominance in Europe. This counterfactual cannot be tested, but it represents serious critique of the decision to fight on. Economic historian Corelli Barnett articulated this critique forcefully. Britain destroyed itself financially to fight Germany. "We emerged victorious but bankrupt, dependent on American aid, unable to maintain our empire or global position. Within 30 years of 1945, Britain had declined from global superpower to medium-sized European country. One must ask whether this outcome served British interests better than negotiated peace would have. Churchill saved Britain's honor, but possibly destroyed Britain's future." The moral dimension of Britain's strategic bombing campaign also attracted criticism. British bombers struck German cities, killing civilians and destroying homes, in campaign that some argued constituted war crime or at minimum moral abandonment of principles Britain claimed to defend. The Dresden bombing of February 1945, though outside the period of Britain fighting alone, symbolized controversies about strategic bombing that began during Britain's isolated period. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, who commanded Bomber Command, defended strategic bombing as military necessity. Germany was bombing our cities, killing our civilians, destroying our homes. They had done so to Rotterdam, to Warsaw, to London. We had limited means to strike at German war-making capacity. Strategic bombing was one of few ways we could take the war to Germany. Whether it was morally perfect is a different question than whether it was militarily necessary. I believe it was necessary, and I make no apology for doing what was required to defeat Nazi Germany. The relationship between Britain and its empire during this period also deserves critical examination. Britain relied heavily on empire resources, troops from India, raw materials from Africa and Asia, Dominion support from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Yet these contributions often received inadequate recognition, and the empire peoples who fought for Britain gained little immediate benefit. Indian soldiers fought in North Africa and elsewhere, yet India remained under British control without self-governance. This exploitation of empire resources to sustain Britain's war effort raises moral questions about whose fight this really was. Indian historian Srinath Raghavan addressed this complexity. India contributed enormously to Britain's war effort. 2.5 million soldiers, vast resources, industrial production. Yet India remained colonial possession without voice in its own governance. Indian soldiers died fighting for freedom in Europe, while their own people remained unfree. The irony was not lost on Indian nationalists, who questioned why Indians should die for British Empire. Britain's survival depended on empire resources, yet this dependence hastened empire's dissolution after the war. The criticism extends to examining whether Britain's strategy actually hastened eventual Allied victory or prolonged the war. Some analysts argue that German invasion of Soviet Union would have occurred regardless of Britain's resistance, and that American entry into the war after Pearl Harbor was similarly inevitable. If these events were independent of Britain's actions, then Britain's isolated resistance accomplished little except preventing its own defeat. Important for Britain, certainly, but not necessarily crucial for ultimate Allied victory. This critique was partially addressed by German generals after the war, many of whom argued that Britain's continued resistance had significant strategic impact on German planning. Field Marshal von Rundstedt stated, "Britain's refusal to make peace complicated every German strategic decision after 1940. We had to maintain forces in the West, defend against British bombing, protect Atlantic coast against possible British invasion. These were resources we could not employ in Russia. Britain's resistance, even when they could not defeat us, fixed German forces and attention that might otherwise have been concentrated against the Soviet Union." The question of whether Britain's resistance was brave or foolhardy remains contested. Supporters view it as finest moment, demonstration of courage and principle that saved Western civilization. Critics view it as reckless gamble that happened to succeed but could have ended disastrously. The truth likely contains elements of both. Brave decision made under desperate circumstances, motivated by combination of principle and refusal to accept defeat, that happened to succeed partly through British determination and partly through German strategic errors. The class dimensions of Britain's war effort also deserve critical scrutiny. While propaganda emphasized shared sacrifice, reality was more complex. Working-class neighborhoods suffered disproportionately from bombing. Rationing affected poor families more severely than wealthy ones who had resources to supplement official rations. Military casualties came disproportionately from working-class recruits in infantry units, yet the narrative of national unity obscured these disparities, and post-war Britain did not immediately address the social inequalities that had been temporarily masked by wartime solidarity. Historian Angus Calder examined this complexity. The myth of the People's War, all classes united in common cause, contains truth, but also obscures important realities. Working-class communities bore disproportionate burden of suffering, yet this suffering was real, the determination authentic and the achievement genuine. The critique of class inequalities need not diminish recognition of collective accomplishment. Britain fought alone because all classes, despite their differences and inequalities, chose resistance over surrender. The feminist critique of Britain's war narrative also merits attention. Women played crucial roles in Britain's war effort, in factories, civil defense, auxiliary services, and maintaining home front, yet their contributions were often minimized in post-war accounts focused on male military heroism. The narrative of Britain fighting alone typically emphasizes Churchill, RAF pilots, and military commanders, while women's essential work receives less attention. This gender imbalance in historical memory reflects broader patterns of marginalizing women's contributions to collective achievements. The post-war treatment of Britain's wartime allies and colonial subjects also invites criticism. Polish pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain found themselves unable to return home after Soviet domination of Poland. Colonial subjects who fought for Britain received inadequate recognition and continued to face discrimination and colonial rule. The Atlantic Charter, proclaimed by Churchill and Roosevelt, promised self-determination for all peoples, yet Britain resisted applying this principle to its own empire. The gap between wartime rhetoric about freedom and post-war reality of continued imperial control created legitimate grievances among those who had supported Britain's fight. The statements German generals made after the war about Britain's isolated resistance fundamentally challenged narratives that had developed during the conflict. These were not admissions of defeat by broken men seeking excuses. They were professional military assessments by officers trained to analyze operations objectively. Their conclusions shocked the world because they acknowledged that Britain's lonely stand had accomplished something profound. It had prevented German strategic victory at the moment when such victory seemed inevitable. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's post-war statement captured this recognition with stark clarity. Britain's survival was the turning point of the war, not the Battle of Britain specifically, not any single engagement, but the simple fact that Britain did not collapse when isolated. Germany's best opportunity for victory was in 1940 after France fell. If Britain had negotiated peace, Or if we had successfully invaded, Germany would have consolidated control over Europe, with no enemies remaining, except eventually the Soviet Union. Britain's refusal to accept this reality meant we never achieved the strategic position necessary for ultimate victory. Everything that followed, the two-front war, the resource drain, the eventual defeat, flowed from Britain's decision to fight on when alone. General Blumentrit's assessment went further, acknowledging British strategic sophistication that German intelligence had not anticipated. We thought Britain was finished in June 1940. Instead, they demonstrated strategic patience and political unity that our analysis had not predicted. They understood that they did not need to defeat us immediately. They needed only to avoid defeat while waiting for circumstances to change. This strategic patience, combined with economic management and diplomatic success in securing American support, created conditions where our early victories became meaningless. By the time we invaded Russia, Britain was stronger than it had been a year earlier, despite fighting alone. This was strategic achievement of highest order. The technological revelations shocked German military professionals perhaps most profoundly. Learning that Britain had broken Enigma codes and read German communications throughout the war forced reassessment of countless operations. Admiral Dönitz, in testimony at Nuremberg and later memoirs, acknowledged, "The intelligence war was completely one-sided, and we did not know it." British intelligence advantages, ultra-intercepts, radar, direction finding, gave them capabilities that neutralized our numerical advantages. When I learned that they had been reading our submarine communications, I understood why we lost the Atlantic campaign. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome the advantage of reading the enemy's orders. Britain's investment in intelligence paid dividends that exceeded what we achieved through all our military preparations. The moral and psychological dimensions of the revelations proved equally significant. German generals acknowledged that their assessment of British morale under bombing had been completely wrong. General Kesselring admitted, "We thought we understood morale effects of terror bombing from our experiences in Poland and Rotterdam. We expected British civilians to pressure their government for peace. Instead, the bombing unified British society and gave them moral certainty that they were fighting evil." This was profound miscalculation, rooted in failure to understand British political culture and history. Island peoples who have resisted invasion for centuries do not collapse under aerial bombardment. The economic revelations showed German understanding of British capabilities had been deficient. Germany had prepared its economy for war through four-year plan and autarkic policies. Yet Britain, with smaller resource base and greater dependency on imports, somehow sustained war production that exceeded German expectations. Post-war analysis revealed that British economic management, priority allocation, American supply arrangements, and ruthless focus on military production achieved results that German economic intelligence had thought impossible. Albert Speer, who directed German war production, acknowledged this in his memoirs. British production achievements surpassed what we thought possible. Their aircraft production exceeded ours during the Battle of Britain. Their shipbuilding program replaced losses faster than we anticipated. Their tank production eventually supported multiple armored divisions. We had underestimated their economic capacity and management skill. They proved that democratic economies could match or exceed totalitarian economic organization when properly motivated and led. The strategic admission from German generals that Britain's survival prevented ultimate German victory represented most shocking revelation. During the war, German propaganda had dismissed Britain as defeated and irrelevant. Post-war statements revealed that German military professionals never believed this propaganda. They understood that Britain's continued resistance created strategic complications that eventually proved fatal to German ambitions. The two-front war that Germany's strategic tradition had always sought to avoid became inevitable once Britain refused defeat. General Halder's diary entries published after the war revealed this understanding. The Führer's decision to invade Russia while Britain remained undefeated violated fundamental principles of German strategy. I argued against it, as did others, but Hitler believed that conquering Russia would force Britain to terms. This was wishful thinking. Britain had already demonstrated that it would not accept German dominance regardless of military situation. Creating a two-front war virtually guaranteed eventual defeat, yet we proceeded because Hitler willed it. Britain's resistance made this disastrous decision possible. The human dimension of these German admissions also merits attention. These were men who had served Hitler's regime, who had conquered most of Europe, who bore responsibility for enormous suffering. Their post-war acknowledgements of British strategic skill and determination did not excuse their service to Nazi Germany, yet their professional assessments carried weight precisely because they came from former enemies who had every reason to minimize British achievement. When German generals acknowledged that Britain's isolated resistance had been strategically decisive, they validated what British participants had believed, but what many observers had doubted. The broader historical impact of Britain's lonely stand became clearer as German post-war statements accumulated. Britain had not merely survived, it had provided proof that Nazi Germany could be resisted, that determination and strategic skill could overcome numerical disadvantage, that democratic societies could match totalitarian ones in sustained conflict. This proof sustained resistance movements across occupied Europe, influenced American public opinion regarding support for Britain, and eventually helped shape the alliance that would defeat Germany. So Winston Churchill, reflecting on this period decades later, acknowledged both the desperation and the significance. We did not know we would survive. We knew only that we would not surrender. Whether this was wisdom or stubbornness, I cannot say. Perhaps it was both. But I believe we proved something important, that tyranny could be resisted, that a free people could sustain the fight when everything seemed lost, that British character forged over centuries would not yield to momentary adversity. When German generals later acknowledged these things, they validated what we had hoped but could not prove during the dark days when we stood alone. The legacy of Britain's isolated resistance extends beyond military history into questions about national character, strategic culture, and the role of principle in statecraft. German generals, analyzing this period with professional detachment years after events, concluded that Britain had fought according to strategic logic that German analysis had not anticipated. The island power with limited military resources had employed geography, sea power, intelligence, economic management, and sheer determination to create defensive position that Germany could not overcome. This achievement, acknowledged by former enemies, represents one of history's remarkable examples of successful strategic defense. Britain did not defeat Germany during the period of fighting alone. That would require allies, years of war, and enormous sacrifice. But Britain prevented German victory at the moment when such victory appeared inevitable. This negative achievement, denying the enemy decisive success, created conditions for eventual Allied victory. German generals, with professional honesty that shocked audiences expecting nationalist excuse-making, acknowledged that Britain's lonely stand had been the turning point that made all subsequent Allied successes possible. The revelation that Germany's most experienced military professionals viewed Britain's resistance not as futile gesture, but as strategically decisive action, transformed historical understanding of the war's trajectory. Popular narratives had emphasized heroic resistance and inspiring speeches, while academic analyses often focused on material factors like American industrial production or Soviet manpower. The German generals' post-war admissions suggested that something more profound had occurred. Britain's strategic choices during its isolated period had fundamentally shaped the war's outcome in ways that neither popular sentiment nor academic analysis had fully recognized. Field Marshal von Manstein, among Germany's most respected military strategists, synthesized this perspective in his post-war writings. Britain's greatest achievement was not winning battles. They won few during their isolated period. Their achievement was maintaining capability to continue the war under circumstances where most nations would have capitulated. This maintenance of capability, this refusal to accept defeat, this strategic patience, these were sophisticated strategic choices that our planning had not anticipated. We prepared to fight enemies who would collapse under sufficient pressure. Britain proved that democracies, when defending core interests and animated by genuine determination, could sustain resistance indefinitely. This was a lesson we learned too late. The shocking nature of these German admissions derived partly from their source. These were the generals who had conquered Europe, whose military skill was undeniable, whose professional assessments carried weight regardless of their service to an evil regime. When such men acknowledged that Britain's isolated resistance had been decisive, they provided validation that transcended partisan interpretation. Their statements, made years after defeat when there was no propaganda purpose to serve, represented honest professional assessment of what Britain had accomplished. The psychological impact of learning that German generals had never truly believed Britain could be defeated, that they had understood the invasion's difficulty, recognized British strategic advantages, and worried about the two-front war that Britain's survival would create, provided retrospective comfort to those who had lived through the terror of 1940. Britain's determination to resist had not been foolish or futile. It had been, according to those who had tried to defeat it, the right strategic choice that had prevented German victory and created conditions for eventual Allied success. The tears that German sailors shed when seeing HMS Kelly return pale beside the shock that German generals experienced when recognizing years after the war that their greatest strategic opportunity had been lost not to superior force, but to British determination during the lonely period from 1940 to 1941. These admissions, coming from professional military men trained in objective analysis, validated Britain's wartime narrative while adding dimensions that even British participants had not fully recognized. Britain had fought alone for 2 years, and what German generals said afterward proved that this lonely fight had changed the course of history in ways that contemporaries could not have fully understood. The ultimate vindication of Britain's choice to fight on came not from military victories or territorial gains, but from these acknowledgements by former enemies that the choice had been strategically correct, that it had prevented German victory, and that it had been the foundation upon which eventual Allied success was built. In the ruins of 1945, Britain stood bankrupt and diminished, its empire beginning to dissolve, its global power declining. Yet the professional assessments of German generals confirmed that Britain's isolated resistance had accomplished something of enduring historical significance. It had stood against tyranny when standing alone, had refused defeat when defeat seemed inevitable, and had proven that determination and strategic skill could overcome material disadvantage when fighting for principles that transcended calculation of odds.